In this video, we'll be looking at the early challenges to the Weimar Republic, focusing on the two major threats to its survival, the Spartacist Uprising and the Kapp Putsch. So, to pick up where we left off, World War I ended in November 1918, and Germany was in a truly awful state after the war. The country has just gone through a political revolution that forced Kaiser Wilhelm to abdicate, and a new democratic government came to power, led by Friedrich Ebert. Millions of soldiers were returning home to unemployment, food shortages, and poverty. Oftentimes in history, when there are periods of poverty and hardship, this creates fertile ground for political extremism to rise. Here I think it's important to note some of the differences between left-wing and right-wing ideology. On the extreme left were revolutionary socialists and communists, who believed that the country should be run by the workers themselves. They opposed capitalism and wanted industries and land to be controlled by the people. On the extreme right wing were nationalist and ultra-conservative groups who believed that Germany needed a strong leader, maybe the Kaiser again, a strong army, and capitalism. Ebert was the leader of the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, which was a moderate socialist party that represented the workers and worked closely with the trade unions. It was sort of comparable to Britain's Labour Party at that time. However, during the war, a more radical faction split from the SPD to form the Spartacist League, who wanted a communist revolution in Germany. The group was named after Spartacus, a Roman gladiator who led a rebellion of slaves against the slave masters of ancient Rome. The Spartacist League was led by two main figures, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. They were inspired by the Russian Revolution of 1917, where communists had seized power and set up Soviets, workers' and soldiers' councils to run the country. So in January 1919, less than 2 months after the war had ended, the Spartacist Uprising had broke out in Berlin. Over 100,000 workers took to the streets, occupying newspaper offices and telegraph stations in an attempt to spread their message and overthrow the new government. Ebert's government quickly lost control of the capital, and after the war, the armed forces were in no shape to put down the revolt alone. So Ebert turned to a different force, the Freikorps, also known as the Freikorps. These were soldiers and officers who had been demobilized after the war, but had kept their uniforms and their weapons. They were willing to help, not out of love for the new government, but out of their hatred of communism. Around 2,000 Freikorps were sent to Berlin, and after several days of brutal street fighting, where over 100 people were killed, the uprising was crushed. The government had ordered the Freikorps to arrest Luxemburg and Liebknecht, but instead, they murdered them and dumped their bodies into a canal. No actions were taken against the Freikorps, and Liebknecht and Luxemburg were turned into martyrs for the communist movement, as they believed that Ebert had also betrayed the workers. So, the Republic had survived its first big scare, but the Freikorps would soon be back. By March, their numbers had grown to around 250,000 men, and they were openly anti-democratic and hostile to the Weimar Republic. In the summer of 1919, Germany was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and one of the clauses was that Germany had to reduce its army and disband any irregular military forces, including the Freikorps. So in March 1920, the Freikorps units near Berlin were ordered to be disbanded. Fearing unemployment and the loss of their influence, they turned on the new government. Their figurehead was a conservative politician, Wolfgang Kapp. Around 5,000 Freikorps marched on Berlin and took control of the city. Kapp declared a new government and invited the Kaiser to return from exile. Ebert called on the army for help, but the commander, General Hans von Seeckt, told Ebert that the German army does not fire on the German army. With no military support, the government again turned to another force, but this time the workers and the unions. The government urged the people not to cooperate with the putsch and instead go on a general strike. Millions of workers across Germany stopped working, preventing industries and services from functioning. After 4 days, the military withdrew its support for Kapp and he fled the country. The putsch had collapsed. So in the Spartacist Uprising, it was the extreme left that had tried to overthrow the government and it was crushed by right-wing forces, whilst in the Kapp Putsch, it was the extreme right wing that had tried to overthrow the government and it was stopped by the left. This deep tension between far left-wing and far right-wing forces is actually going to characterize much of the Weimar period. This tension was also reflected in a wave of political violence across Germany. With the army demobilized and the country in chaos, hundreds of thousands of young men joined paramilitary organizations for political parties, who were known for street fighting and violent clashes. Between 1919 and 1922, there were 376 political murders in the Weimar Republic, and some very high-profile names were assassinated. For example, Matthias Erzberger, who signed the surrender to the Allies in 1918, was killed by former Freikorps members in 1921. Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister and basically one of the top 3 most important positions in the government, was also murdered in 1922. The Weimar Republic had survived its first great test, but its foundations were extremely unstable. And if you think it can't get any worse for the Weimar Republic, well, let me introduce you to the crisis year of 1923, which we'll be looking at in the next video. See you then.